Um, Believe it or not, I was actually studying some of this last night and getting dates so that I had some information along with the rest of my message today, and because of that, we should be done by probably 2:30, and kind of go from there. So I hope you brought snacks in your purses and things like that. So who did? Diana brought food? People are already getting up and leaving. I'm just kidding, Joy. There you go. You got a pot with you too, Stephen? We're going to be in Leviticus today. Last week we talked about the fact that God gave us a picture. In the nation of Israel, God chose not a group of people. God did not come down and go, I like that nation better than these. These are a bunch of wicked people. That nation is the one I choose. He chose one man. And we talked about this last week, and Abraham was his name. God said, I think you're a fine man, and I'd like to work with you. I want to make of you a great nation. And when he said that to Abraham, he didn't run away. That's his first good step. And he listened. And when he said, I want you to leave your country and go to a place that you've never been before, and I'm going to do something special. I'm going to make your family, your nation, your people greater than the sands of the sea. And he proceeded to explain to Abraham that there was going to be a son born. He explained to him that he was going to go and that he was going to have to trust God for where he was going. He didn't give him a final destination. He just told him, you go. And a lot of times we kind of forget the fact that faith is all about stepping out where it doesn't make sense. Going out when we don't really think we want to, and doing what God asks us to do. And he says, I want you to leave Ur. How'd you like to grow up in a town named Ur? You are. Ur of the Chaldees is where he grew up, and he left there never to return. And his journey took him many different places. There's lots of stories about places he went and places that he had great things happen, and other places where he almost got killed, and there was a lot of stories in there. But when he finally goes through his whole life wondering when this child is going to happen that God promised him, and it isn't until he's an old man, and I'm not talking about 60 old man, I'm talking about 90s old man, that God says, you're going to have a child next year. Honestly, there's a lot of people in this room, but if God said something to you today about having a child next year, it takes some miracles in a lot of situations. But the point is, we had talked at one time about foster kids and things like that, but it's like, I'd be 70 when they are grown up and in their teenage years. Why would a child want to be, when I'm in my 70s and they're at 15 and saying, come on, let's go play football. It's tough. And that was the message that God brought to Abraham. And we know that Abraham had Isaac. It's on the chart somewhere back in here. And Abraham has Isaac. And God says, yes, this is the son I promised you. Now I want you to take him up on a mountain and sacrifice him. Back then, when you meant sacrifice, you meant stick the knife in and light the fire. And the terminology, J. Vernon McGee, how many of you ever know that name? J. Vernon McGee. Oh, that's hilarious. This side knows J. Vernon McGee, and nobody over here knows that name. I just wondered what separated you all. Now I know. Is that what it is? The sure group and the not so sure? J. Vernon McGee, old time Bible teacher that was on the radio in fact, he's still on the radio, even though he's been dead since, I think, the late 90s, wasn't it? And but he's still, I mean, his Bible teaching is phenomenal. And he's got the most odd voice and mannerisms and everything that you can hear on the radio. I've never seen him in person, so I don't know what he even looks like.
His live sermons when he was younger, he was a pulpit pounder, which sounds.
Oh, okay.
You heard him on the radio first.
Yeah, he's more of an expounder. Yeah. But he said that the term used for Isaac when Abraham and Isaac are going up on the mountain for this sacrifice, and he tells his son, he says, God has told us that we're going to go and sacrifice up on the mountain, okay? And so they go together, and they get up there, and they put this altar together, and they put wood on it, and they get everything ready, and Isaac goes, hey, Dad, where's the offering? If your dad looked at you and said, I don't know how to explain this, son, but climb up on the altar. Climb up on the wood. I can tell you what would happen with most teenagers nowadays. You say teenagers. The word child that it uses for Isaac is a word that J. Vernon McGee said included anyone from like 12 to 30. Isaac could have been in his 20s. Could he have overtaken his 100-year-old dad? Or 130 probably, or 120, let's say, at that time? He probably could have wrestled him down and said, no, Dad, I ain't doing this. Say, well, how did Abraham feel like he could do that with his son? Any thoughts on that? Why would I not put my son or my grandson on an altar with a knife and sacrifice him to God? Why would I not do that? It's my son or my grandson. Why would I want to do that? Out of obedience to God? Well, that's a great idea, but it's my son. It's my grandson. How does that equate? What's the answer?
Abraham trusted God.
He really believed in his heart that if he went through with this, that God would raise his son from the dead right there. He knew that God had the answer. To the point that in the deaf world, the sign for Abraham, you take the letter A and they do this. Why? Because he was going to stab his son with the knife, and it was on the way down when God goes, stop. And so A for Abraham, stop, is what they're saying, and like he has the knife, right? And that's how obedient Abraham was, and the faith that he had in God. And God said, You're my man. You're the one that I'm going to start this great nation with. And that's what started the whole nation of Israel. Not necessarily Israel, but at the time it was the beginning of Abraham's legacy. And Abraham had Isaac, and Isaac had two sons. Who were they? Jacob and Esau. Which one was the good boy and which one was the Esau was always kind of the rebellious outdoors kid that didn't want anything to do with God and all that. But Jacob was God's selected path that he was going to use to start this nation. Jacob, down the road, has his name changed to, and God said, in your name will this nation always be called. And even today, they're called the nation of. Can you tell me of another nation off the top of your mind that is called by a person's name? A nation. I tried to think through, and I can't think of one. America's close. America was named after a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, mentor of Christopher Columbus's. But it's one of the few nations that we still today look at and go, in fact, when you read the word a lot, the Bible talks constantly about him. When it talks about Israel, it talks about him, like it's still represented by Jacob, Israel, and they almost use it interchangeably.
And they use Jacob too.
That's why I say they use it interchangeably all the time. The nation of Jacob or Israel is very commonly used like that. So God says this is the plan. This is the plan. Now, we just sang a song, The Great I Am, the God Almighty, the creator of all of this. And you would think that God has, it was somewhere right around the first of the year that I spoke about, does God have a plan? And we talked about that. And the plan for his son to come and die on a cross, and that's all great. That's a beautiful picture. But what we don't realize is that God not only had a plan, but he painted a picture. He paints a picture so that the world would know. By the way, when was the Bible, what was the first part of the Bible written? What was it? What was the first part of the Bible written? No, what?
Genesis, Exodus, the Pentateuch.
The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were written by God, as far as God was the one transcribing this through Moses. He was the scribe, right? So when you're looking at this idea of the Bible started to be written, couldn't you say to God, that's not fair? Because Moses was only born like 2,000 years before Christ. What happened to the other 2,000 years, and where's the instructions? And yet we look all the way back to Adam and Eve, and what happened when they sinned? Blood was shed. Blood was shed, animals were killed, and their skins were given as a covering to Adam and Eve. That is the earliest picture before of Christ. And it goes on. You got Noah and the ark. You got pictures all through of what's going to happen down the road. And then through the nation of Israel, he writes the book. Not only does he write the book, he writes it in such detail that if we really look at it carefully, the whole picture of his son coming and dying on the cross is there in living color. And it's in the Bible, the New Testament refers to the Old Testament as the schoolmaster. That it was all there. All the stuff that we know today, it was all there. But so many people didn't catch what the vision was. And some of those were even the spiritual leaders didn't get what the vision was. When we look at the fact that God established all these things, He put them into slavery. How did he put them into slavery in Egypt? They make bricks, but how did they go from getting into Egypt to getting out of Egypt? How did that all happen? But back up 400 years. How did they get into Egypt? Okay, remember Abraham, right? Abraham and his son on the altar. God separates him from the altar, says, stop. I know you're obedient. I honor that. But look there's a ram in the thicket, and that's going to substitute for your son. He sacrifices the ram dies, is burned, and it's an offering that's acceptable and pleasing to God. From there, they go down the mountain and go back home. I don't know what Isaac said to his mom, but I sure would have. It would have been an interesting story to watch. Not sure I want to ride with you, huh? So Isaac gets home, grows up, gets married. If you know the story about Rachel and Leah, okay? But he has, out of 2 wives that are sisters, he has 12 sons. Okay, story gets better and better. 12 sons. Now comes the picture that God had prepared, and he says, these 12 sons are going to become the heart of the nation of Israel. At that point, the Bible says that there was, tradition says there was about 75 of them that were there before they went to Egypt. How did they get to Egypt? The story goes, Joseph in the coat of many colors. He's like the 10th of 12 children. No, the 11th, right? 11th of 12 children, because Benjamin's the only little brother he has. But he's born, and Dad likes him better. I know you would never do that in your family, but some people have favorite children. My wife accuses me of being one of those because I was the baby of 6, but she's wrong, I can tell you. If Paula was here, she'd tell you I wasn't the spoiled child. It's because she's not here, right? So Joseph, being the special child, Dad makes him, what was his gift to his son? The coat of many colors, to the point that the world has even made a stage play out of the story and made it into this big Broadway thing that wasn't really accurate, but it was a show for them to do. But the coat of many colors causes him a little bit of grief. And as he's growing up, he dreams. And in his dream, he says, we all had sheaves of wheat standing, and all of a sudden, all your guys, talking to his 11 brother, well, probably 10 brothers at that point, he says, all your sheaves bowed down to mine. Joseph did have a little bit of a pride issue when he was young. And he talked to them about how God's showing these brothers that, so what do the brothers do? A couple of the older ones are like, we got to get rid of this brat. I'm sick of this. I'm done with this. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. Well, clearer minds prevailed at some point, and they ended up, he's ended up in an old well in a pit, and they don't know. They're trying to figure out what to do with the brat. And here comes a caravan of people heading to Egypt that are slave traders. And they're like, wow, here's a thought. Let's take the brother, get a couple bucks, let them take him away, take this beautiful coat of many colors that we all can't stand, and we'll tell Dad that something bad happened. And so they did. They sold him to these slave traders, take the coat, smear a little blood on it from an animal, take it home, put some fake tears in their eyes and go, Dad, Joseph's gone. Okay. Probably early teen years or something. He's very young at the time. Life goes on. Joseph goes down to Egypt, goes into the house of Potiphar, becomes not just a good slave, but the head of the household because he's just such a good guy and he's blessed by God and becomes the head of Potiphar's household. Except Potiphar's wife thinks he's cute, and so she tries to pull him into her bedroom, and Joseph runs. So then she blames him and says, oh, he tried to do something really nasty to me, and so they put him in jail. And he spends a couple months in jail. How many years? 13 years. From 17 to 30. I don't know about you, but about the second year, I'd be bitter. I wouldn't be very happy about the situation. But what does he do? He makes the best of the situation. He's telling people about his God. He's interpreting dreams for some of the people, like the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, I think is how it goes. I'm sorry. But he's interpreting dreams for these men, and in prison, he says to these guys, they're getting out of jail, one through the good door and the other through the bad door, because the bad door guy is going to die, but the good door guy is going to go back to the king's. And he's like, hey, when you get out of here, remember me, okay? And it's still some time down the road that they remember that this guy did interpret dreams, and the king has a dream he's trying to figure out, and so they call out Joseph. And he goes from prison to being one of the tops in the country, to the point that down the line, he's second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Now, all of Egypt is more than the 75 people that were in Joseph's family. But the famine came, and as the famine comes, everybody, because of Joseph's wisdom, everybody flocks to Egypt because God revealed to him this 7 years and 7 years, feast and famine, and during the years of feast, they put it aside. The 7 years of famine, they had plenty, and people were coming from all over to get food. Joseph's second in the nation now, and it's been probably 15 years, and his brothers come down to get food for Dad. Dad's an old man, not real good shape. He's sad because he lost his favorite son. And long story short, Joseph runs into his brothers. They don't know it's him. They don't recognize him. He was just a kid when they got rid of him. Now he's a grown man, second ruler in Egypt. They don't know who he is. And he doesn't even let them know that he can speak their language. He speaks through interpreter. And he acts like he's just some Egyptian bigwig, which he is at that point. But then he does what? When they get their grain to go home, he puts some stuff in their sack. And then as they get off on the trail home, he sends someone after him and says, why'd you steal from the king? It's like, oh boy. So through this whole thing, that's not the whole story today, but the story ends up that Joseph ends up bringing his whole family, father, brothers, wives, children, and the Bible says there were 75 persons that came to Egypt. 75. All right? When they leave Egypt 400 years later, there's over 1 million people in their company. They grew. Did they go into Egypt as slaves? No. They were welcomed in as the family of the second top guy in the whole nation. And were honored and were made to live in the palace and all kinds of good places. 400 years later, the Bible even says the new Pharaoh didn't know Joseph and didn't know anything about him, and so basically they were not as important as they used to be. And because of that, the Israelites, they're just part of the country. And the Pharaoh goes, man, these guys multiply quicker than bunny rabbits. And you know what? If we're not careful, they're going to take over our country. So let's make slaves out of them instead of just free people. Did God put them into slavery? They just kind of transformed into a natural thing that they were now the workers for all the Egyptians. We don't see it this way very well, but the picture is your life has almost all those elements in it at some point. You can almost picture yourself through that whole story, and even to the point of, how did I get to this point in my life when I used to be almost royalty, on the edge of being someone like great and young and healthy? All of a sudden now I'm like oppressed. I remember when I was in my late 30s, I said it to my wife, and I don't know exactly what her response was, but I remember saying, I don't know why I've become so cynical. Where it seemed like I could find everything to complain about. Nothing was good enough. And every job I had was like just going to be temporary because I needed to find something better. And I don't know, but you know, you talk about men in midlife crisis, supposed to be at 45, Stephen. So watch it this year. It's going to happen, you know. You already been fighting it for 10 years, huh? An early bloomer. But when you have this whole thing in the 40s, we all go through it, and it's like, man, I'm literally about half done, and I've accomplished nothing. And you get this struggle inside going, come on, we got to do something here with ourselves. And a lot of people are driven by that. And yet, it's kind of like the nation of Israel. You come into this point where you almost become enslaved to all the things that are going on, and you don't know how to even move forward. And at the same time, God heard the cries of Israel, heard the cries of the people that were working their tails off every single day, and in the hot desert sun. And it says the Lord heard the cries, and all of a sudden we're introduced to Moses. Now this is 400 years after Joseph came to Egypt, and now this people has grown to over 1 million strong. And God says to Moses, when he was 80, not when he was a young buck. Why? Because Moses goes through the same things we do. And as a young buck, Moses wasn't ready to lead a group of 1 million people out of a country. He would have messed it up. So he grows up in Pharaoh's house. You know the story, the baby in the basket, hidden by the side of the river. The Pharaoh's daughter comes down, finds him, takes him home to mom and dad, and goes, look what I found. And she raises a little baby that's not even hers, and he becomes trained in Pharaoh's courts by the finest teachers. Here's a beautiful picture, though. The first 5 books of this Bible were not written by English authors. The first verse says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It wasn't written that way. And if I knew it wasn't even Hebrew that he probably spoke back then, but whatever Moses spoke that he wrote it in to that first verse in the Bible was written because God allowed the nation of Israel that he was planning for a huge future, allowed them to become stuck in the mud of Egypt for 400 years. You think you got a bad time? For 400 years, they're stuck there, and God plants a baby, one child, to be the deliverer of his people. Again, another picture of our Savior. Didn't just show up one day in the middle of the group and go, you know what, I'm tough enough, I'm going to do this. No, it was a little baby that God planned and raised him in Pharaoh's courts. The only way that the Israelites, they had no form of writing prior to that. None. Moses shows up, and he's like, hey guys, how can I help here? Why are those guys fighting over there? Stop it. Hey, I said stop it. Stop it or I'm going to take you out. Okay, and he kills a guy. Oh boy, now I'm in trouble. What am I going to do? Next day, sees a couple of Israelite brothers fighting. And he goes, guys, stop your fighting. We got to kind of pull together. They look at him like, look at you, all dressed up like the king's boy. Because he was in Pharaoh's palace every day. And they're like, what are you talking to us for? Leave us alone. And then one of them goes, what are you going to do? Kill us like you did the Egyptian yesterday? Moses goes, I'm out of here. And where does he go? He flees to Midian. Runs across a cute girl at a watering hole, waters the camels for her and gets her water and gets her ready and sends her home. She goes home and says, Dad, guess what? I had the coolest thing happen today. Got out there, and this guy, he watered the camels, and he gave me water, and he just was like, he was an awesome guy. I don't know who he was. And Dad goes, and you didn't bring him home? I mean, literally, it's like, what? Go get the guy. Hey, a bunch of you servants, go get this guy. Her dad is the priest of Midian. He gives his daughter to Moses, and for what? 40 more years. He's 40 when this happens, and for 40 more years, he's a shepherd. Until what? The burning bush. The burning bush. Beautiful story. All of a sudden, you're out there and something's burning. It's not that burning bush over there. Okay, there's a burning bush right there. All right? It's red every fall and it's beautiful. No, this was fire. Fire that did not consume. And all of a sudden, it says Moses goes, I'm going to turn off this path and go see what that is. Kind of an odd statement to say to yourself. And so he goes over there, and a voice says, take your shoes off. You're on holy ground. All right, about that time, how many of you would still be there? And he says, boy, he takes his shoes off and gets serious. What people don't realize a lot of times is if you read deep into that story with Moses and the conversation of the burning bush, that he truly does not know God in a personal way. I'm sure that he was taught by his mother the 6 or 8 years that he was at the house being brought up at first, but then he's been indoctrinated by Pharaoh's people for 30-some years before this all happens, and then he's been on the backside of the desert with these sheep for 40 years, and all of a sudden this voice is talking to him out of the burning bush. He doesn't know what to do. In fact, he tries to talk God out of his plan because he says, I'm going to have you lead my people, Israel, out of Egypt. And he's like, why would they listen to me? Why would they listen to me? Who am I? They don't even know my name. Well, he must have, because he sure complained about it till God finally gave him his brother to speak for him, right? But he said, you got the wrong guy. And he goes, no, you're the person, and you are going to lead my people out of. And he goes, but how do I do that? What do I got to go talk to the elders of Israel? And he's like, go talk to the elders of Israel. Well, who do I say sent me? It's the place in the Bible where this name is introduced. The I Am. The song we sang this morning. The great I Am. You tell them that the I Am sent you. Now that's the difference between someone coming up to you and going, if someone walked in here today and said, Mark, get out of the way. All right, everybody, we're going to just grow this into a 10,000 person church. Follow me. Out the door we go. Some of you would be like, who are you? Why would we don't even know what you believe. But this guy comes in, Moses comes in and says, I am sent me. Make long story short, you know the routine. They went through the 10 plagues. They get to the final one. Moses is giving instructions to the people and said, you're to take a lamb, 1 year old, and you're supposed to make sure it's spotless. Perfect picture of Christ, a spotless lamb. You're supposed to take that lamb and you're going to watch it for 4 days to make sure that it's perfect. And then on this day, you're going to kill that lamb. Before sunset, you're going to have it cooked and ready to go. After sunset, you're going to eat it. And then whatever's not eaten, you're going to burn it up so that nothing remains in the morning. You're going to have your clothes on ready to go. And we are leaving this country. You say, well, okay, that's kind of weird. Why the lamb and why this and why that? God paints pictures throughout his whole course of history with the Jews that tell the whole story of his son. Because they called that the Passover because God said, when you take the blood of that lamb and sprinkle it on the doorpost and the lintel of your door of your house, the death angel will pass over and not enter your house, and the firstborn in your house won't die. But every house where there is not the blood on the doorpost and lintel, the firstborn of every family will die, including you, Pharaoh. And it happened. And it said there was wailing like you'd never heard before over the whole land of Egypt as the firstborn in every single house died. I can't imagine. Can't imagine. But let's say the firstborn was, let's say mom and dad, and there was only 2 kids in the whole country in each house. That's still 1 out of 4 in every house in the whole country that died. And it might have been dad was the firstborn and his dad was still alive, he would have died. I mean, we can't comprehend what that tragedy was like for Egypt. And it was animals too. Imagine that. It's like, don't you think Egypt's going to go, this is not just natural causes, something's going on here. And God states, as we pointed out last week, God states that I will have my glory on Egypt. Not on Israel. He's not saying, I'm going to show Israel. He's saying Egypt will know that I am God. They will know that I'm God. And because of that, Pharaoh, it's like, get out of here. Just get your people and go. And they do, and they go. And last week we looked at the fact that God told them to camp over against the sea. Now, if you're a military kind of a guy who's doing strategy and stuff, the last thing you want to do is put yourself up against something that you can't. It's like you're cornered, right? And when word got back to Pharaoh that, hey, I guess they're lost or something, but they camped over against the Red Sea, and it's not a good situation for them. We can take them. They can't get away from us. God says camp by the Red Sea because God knew in his heart and his mind, I'm going to deliver them in a way that no one will ever forget. So they kill the lambs. They spread the blood on their doorposts. The firstborn die. They're kicked out of the country. And then Pharaoh's sitting there and he's going, my son died, my animals died, this and that, all my people. And he goes, get your chariots. We're going after them. And off they go. And it's not hard to catch people 1 million strong. They're not necessarily moving at a fast pace at that point. because the slowest of the people are the speed that you can go. And didn't take them long to overtake them. And so here's these Egyptians out in the middle of the desert, and they're going, what's that noise? What do you, I don't hear a noise. You hear a noise? I just hear a funny noise. It's like thunder or something. And by the way, why is that whole horizon over there dust looking like a dust storm coming? Didn't take them long to figure out what the noise was. Didn't take them long to figure out they were in trouble. What's the first thing they do? Bible says, we saw this last week, they cried out to God. And then the second thing they did was said to Moses, what are you doing? You trying to get us killed out here? And of course, you know the story of the Red Sea. God tells Moses, you raise your rod up over the waters, and I'm sorry, you can watch every explanation of the Red Sea parting that you want. Some people say it blew for 3 or 4 months and dried the whole end of the Red Sea up that was real shallow. Okay? Well then, my Bible must be a lie, because it says that they passed through on dry ground, and it was as a wall of water on either side of them. I'm sorry, but if the Bible says a wall of water, they weren't going through in a muddy, partially dried up little reed area, marshy area. They went through a place where the water was literally stacked like nature wouldn't do it. It was done in a way that it was obvious, to the point that the Egyptians, I love the part where even before they get there, it says the Egyptians, God slowed them down. He knocked the wheels off their chariots. Now, picture that if you're the poor horse, okay? Pulling this chariot on wheels, and all of a sudden the wheels fall off, and now you're dragging a chariot with 2 or 3 guys in each chariot in the sand. Interesting picture. And it slows them all down. But they get there just as the Israelites step into that water and start going across. And as they go across, I know I've said this before, but I can't help but picture it in my mind every time. They're going through this wide thing with walls of water on each side, and fish are going swim, 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 whoop, because right out this wall of water, no water. But they don't have time to stop and collect the fish, so they keep going. And they're halfway across when all of a sudden they look back, and here comes the chariots into the same path that God prepared for them. Now, how is that right? God could have just closed that water back in behind Israel and let them get to the other side. Because because God said, I will have my glory on Egypt. And when we're done, God says, all of Egypt will know that I'm God. And that's why the 10 plagues are said to have lined up with the different gods that Egypt had, and everyone mocked their gods that they had of certain things. And so right down to the last one, God was showing them, I'm better than all your gods. I'm better than all your sorcerers and all your people that think they're better than me. I am God. And now I'm going to show you that. And as Pharaoh hardens his heart, chases after Israel, he's in the middle of the Red Sea, and then it says, God let the waters come back together, and they literally, and guess who was probably at the front of that pile? Pharaoh. Pharaoh and his horsemen. The Israelites sang this song often. Pharaoh and his horsemen cast into the sea. And we look at that and it's like, where's the picture there? Go back to the Passover. The death angel passed over the houses where the blood was on the doorpost and the lintel. The blood of a lamb. Is that a picture of something? Oh my. We're going to be studying in the next couple weeks the feasts of Israel. God established the feast of Passover in Leviticus 23 and says, It's a real long passage, so let's read it. Should be out of here by 2. Leviticus 23. The reason I'm having you turn here is because if you have time this week, read the whole chapter. Leviticus 23. It's got all the 7 feast days that the Jews observed from the Bible. They have probably a half a dozen more feast days now that they added to their calendar, but the 7, and you know the number 7 is a very important number to God, but that number was a very strategic picture of what God was doing. So in this Leviticus chapter 23, and the Passover explanation is verses 4 and 5, but 4 really doesn't count. So that's why I said it's a long passage. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at evening is the Lord's Passover. Okay? The Passover is one of 7 feast days. There's 4 in the spring and there's 3 in the fall. I bet you that if I can turn that off, that 3/4 of the people in here could not name all 7 feasts from just plain memory, let alone say how each one equates to our Savior, Jesus Christ. The Passover is the first feast in the spring, and it's the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which is their first month. It's not in January. It's usually March, April. Their calendar is different than ours. It's the 15th day of their first month, and theirs is a lunar calendar, and it goes also with the spring equinox. They have a whole different thing that determines their calendar than we do. The fingerprints of Satan are all over trying to make it so we didn't understand their calendar. But the Passover happened, and the picture there was that you killed a lamb to deliver this whole people out of bondage into a trip to the promised land. It wasn't just a 11-day trip that it should have been. It was 40 years. But it still was accomplishing the entrance of Israel into the promised land. Jesus Christ came as the Savior, as a baby. He died on the cross. He was proclaimed by John the Baptist, behold, look at that guy right there coming right now to me is the Lamb of God. And what he was saying was, you know that lamb we kill every year at Passover time to look back on the deliverance from Egypt? That lamb's blood we put on our doorposts and lintel that represents the blood that's going to happen when our Messiah comes? See, God had a perfect picture right down to the details. And that's why it angers me. It has for years, when people try to tell me that Jesus died on a Friday, but the Bible tells me he was in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. You can't get the number no matter how many times people cut it up what way they want to. There had to be 3 days and 3 nights. And he did that. He fulfilled every single detail. And it was a perfect picture from the Passover in Egypt and the deliverance of the nation of Israel. Just like the Passover lamb was killed on the cross for you and me. It was their picture looking forward to how this was going to happen. And it happened exactly the way God drew the picture back 2,000 years earlier. And the smartest people in all of Israel did not. You can look at a painting. You could look at that painting every day for 100 years, and if Becky put some little secret things in there that she thought people would gradually figure out what they meant, people would still look at it and go, that's an interesting painting, and just walk on. And God put all the information there for us, and yet we miss it. And so the next few weeks, we're going to talk about these different feasts not because we're going to observe them, not because we're called to continue doing sacrifices of little lambs at the time of Passover, but because we have to understand what God was doing from day one to this current day and even into the book of Revelation to come. It's all going to be fulfilled. By the way, the stuff on the right, the fall feasts, you're looking at future events. These have not yet been fulfilled by Christ, but they will. When does the rapture happen? What's that? The last trumpet. Isn't that amazing that the first feast day in the fall is called the Feast of Trumpets? Do you think maybe that might be when the rapture would happen? Christ would take us out of this mess? Maybe. I know everybody wants to say, the verse says, no man knows the day or the hour. Never said I was claiming a day, but I can guarantee you there's going to be trumpets sound because that's what Thessalonians says. And the Day of Atonement, what's that? What does atone means? David? What does atonement mean?
Christ took our place.
It's
Expiation for our sins.
It's the substitution of what you deserve being covered by someone else. And he's atoning, he's paying, he's taking the penalty that you deserve to pay and paying for it. And you've probably heard this term more than you've heard Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur. You ever heard that before? Jewish holiday. It's one of the few, but it's one of their most holy days in their calendar. And then you got the Feast of Tabernacles. The Jewish nation still does this. They have a week where they live in tents in their backyard. They have their house, but they go out and make a little tent, and then they live in it. And they look back to when they were in the wilderness, and they were living in tents. And they try to remember that and thank God for not being there. No, they miss the picture. The picture is when Christ says, I go to prepare a place for you. It's a good picture there of tabernacles, not living in tents in a desert, but living in houses in the promised land, living in the mansion that God has prepared for us. That's why all of this comes together and God says, I laid it all out. I taught Moses how to write so he could lay it out in a book for you. I did all this for you so that you could know and you could see it all come together. So as we study this, I hope if you get a chance, read Leviticus 23. It's a great chapter. It tells you all of those 7 feast days, when they are and what they are, but not a lot of detail. So we'll cover those more as we go. If you'll stand with me, we're going to close today.